Welcome to the fifth of the UCL European Institute podcasts in our Talking Europe series. My name is Uta Staiger. I'm Executive Director of the European Institute, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome Miriam Leonard, Professor of Greek Literature and its reception here at UCL's Department of Classics. Today, we are here to discuss a special issue of a journal, Classical Philology, which appeared earlier this year and focuses on Hannah Arendt and the ancients. And Miriam edited the volume, but she also wrote the preface and an article on Arendt's revolutionary antiquity, an outcome, I'm very pleased to say, from a conference that the European Institute co-sponsored in late 2015. So welcome, Miriam. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Otto. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Hannah Arendt and the ancients, then. Possibly a very brief situating. Hannah Arendt lived through the first 3/4 of the 20th century and really was what you could call a political thinker of modernity. Her work covered topics of revolution, of totalitarianism, of the now well-known phrase banality of evil. You could say, as her 1958 book had it not exactly unambitiously, she was interested in the human condition as a whole. And yet, of course, while thinking through modernity in this way, Arendt made pervasive references to Greek antiquity in her work. And of course, it's now precisely this relationship that the collection of articles that you have brought out illuminates so wonderfully. And I think, as you put it in the preface, Miriam, it says Arendt's encounter with the ancients holds the key to understanding some of the most urgent ethical, political and aesthetic questions of our times. So with that, I mean, the real question is, to start us off, why Hannah Arendt? What drew you personally to her work?
Thank you for that introduction and for situating Arendt in relation to some of the themes in my work and her talking a bit about her relevance to modernity. And I think that may be probably where I started, that in my reading around my interest, she was a name that came up very frequently. She's an inspiration, as you said, for a lot of the thinkers who I'd already been working on, and in particular of very contemporary thinkers, people like Judith Butler or figures who were talking precisely about questions of political organisation today. And how that related back to my interests is that I've for a long time been interested in how questions of classical antiquity have been used as a source of inspiration for talking about the problems of modernity, generally speaking, but with a particular focus on questions of politics. And I started my work in this area by looking at post-war French philosophy and the kind of encapsulated in the moment, if you like, of Jacques Derrida reading Plato while the students were barricading the Sorbonne. So the idea that in May 1968, Jacques Derrida publishes Plato's Pharmacy at a time when the European movement of protest is happening at the same time, and I was trying to think through that connection. Was this just a rejection of modernity? Was it turning back on the question of politics and action into a sort of scholarly antiquarianism, or were the two events actually related? So in my early work, as I said, I worked quite closely on the French tradition and how questions of particularly, again, questions of political subjectivity have been thought through in relation to the legacy of figures like Plato on the one hand and classical Greek tragedy on the other. And then in order to understand that tradition, I felt like I had to go backwards in time to understand how people like Derrida or Foucault had themselves got their ideas about antiquity from figures from largely the German tradition. We think primarily of a figure like Nietzsche or Heidegger as being behind that moment, but they themselves were in part of a much longer tradition of German engagements with antiquity, reading back to the 18th century. And so in my career, I've sort of done I keep going backwards, trying to kind of pull on the thread of why antiquity has been so important to modernity, and that brought me back to some of all the way back to the Enlightenment, really, and back to that originary kind of moment of engagement with classical antiquity. And I think we'll see in our conversation how that kind of movement from the contemporary back to the Enlightenment and the French and American revolutions there has been important for even the way I think about Hannah Arendt. But why Arendt in that? She wasn't actually someone I'd looked at in any great detail, because she doesn't quite fit into either of those traditions. She's neither in the sort of post-war, post-structuralist kind of tradition, which is still very relevant in all sorts of ways, nor the kind of tradition of German Philhellenism that I was looking at in another direction, although she's clearly in her relationship to Heidegger in particular, clearly an inheritor of some of those ideas, but she doesn't fit neatly into either of those particular traditions, and yet she, perhaps even more than many of those figures, places antiquity at the centre of her analyses. And there's a sort of freshness to her approach to antiquity, which I thought was really interesting and one that needed to be investigated further.
Great, thank you. This is really a wonderful setting, if you like, because on the one hand, it clearly shows to me just how much your own practice is one of reading and rereading and recontextualizing and rethinking a history of readings, which is, of course, precisely what Arendt also does in her various temporal references and her reading Marx, reading Hegel, and Hegel reading the ancient texts. So we have a wonderful sort of parallelism here, which is striking. And yes, you do say that she is very fresh, she's very unusual. She didn't even call herself a political philosopher. She obviously rejected that sort of specific term herself, and it's therefore also reason, of course, that her work's always been quite difficult to grasp, if you like. What I really enjoyed when I started reading your texts is just how at the very beginning you set out sort of approaching Arendt and approaching the question of revolution, which is what you focus on in your article, and how she goes back to the ancients in that, is how you sort of set it up against one of her most well-known books, which is The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was written roughly a decade earlier. And it's against the deeply pessimistic outlook of the former that you characterized on revolution as her perhaps most hopeful and most optimistic book. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how you situate that in the larger context of her.
Yeah. So I do think that there's a sort of very conscious attempt to rethink the 20th century going on revolution, that she had come onto the scene and had made her name through her analysis of Nazism and Stalinism, and that is how she characterized her vision of modernity was through the forensic and very historically minded approach to that phenomenon. And as you say, which was written in 1951, roughly about a decade earlier. And in the intervening years, interestingly, she wrote her other magnum opus, which is the Human Condition, which you referenced in the introduction, which is a much more philosophical, one might say, or abstract, less historical study, which is related in all sorts of ways to her discussion of totalitarianism, but goes off in a different direction. In particular, does something different when antiquity becomes much more central to her interests there. So many of the kind of concepts, the political concepts that she begins to analyse in The Human Condition, lead her in a different direction, I think, from the kind of historical analysis that she engages in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and in particular her discussion of action there, the way in which the notion of action becomes central to her political agenda, I think, then finds a new kind of historical situation in her analysis of the phenomenon of revolution. And that's not to say that I think that the On Revolution is a wholly optimistic book. It's a very critical book. It's like everything that Arendt writes. It's not an easy book, and it's not a book which simply celebrates a phenomenon. Carl Jaspers actually called it a tragic book, and I think there, as I mentioned somewhere, I think we can see that from partly as a reference to some of the things she says about tragedy in the book, but in particular to the conclusion, which is rather strange for this book, that she ends with an analysis of Oedipus at Colonus, Sophocles' last play, and which wouldn't be necessarily what one would think of when one was thinking of an analysis of 20th century revolution. So while I think it is a hopeful book, and it contrasts markedly in tone with The Origins of Totalitarianism, I don't think it's a simple celebration of action. But I think it shows a shift in her thinking towards a kind of discussion of the potentiality of action in concert, which is something that she had began to sort of conceptualize more abstractly in The Human Condition.
You talk about history and the sort of historical approach, and I think in interesting ways, On Revolution gives us a good way in here to talk about the relationship between past and present and ancient and modern, in the sense that she really draws up a framework with different temporal references. Greek antiquity, the American and the French revolutions of the late 18th century, and then obviously the modernity of Arendt's 20th century. I just wonder if you could expand a little more on exactly that relationship that she begins to draw up between the ancient and the sort of the revolutionary epoch and her own.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's one of the things that's most disconcerting about the book in a way, because it's meant to be a book about what she calls the physiognomy of the 20th century. And as I say, that is very much related to, in terms of who she represented at the time, would be very much related to her analysis of totalitarianism, which was sort of the quintessential modern phenomenon that she was associated with. And one of the interesting things there is that in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she really talks about a kind of break. She sees the advent of Nazism as really creating a complete rupture in terms of tradition. And it's really at the moment, at that point, that she talks about, a complete inability to see a continuity, to think about the kind of tradition as a continuity. Interestingly, on Revolution, she seems to be able to. I don't think she goes back on that. I still think that she thinks there is a marked caesura or a marked break. But the interesting temporality that you sketch shows that there is this kind of fluidity, this ability to move between different periods. And the book is marked, on the one hand, by this sense of continuity, that she constantly is going back to antiquity, and she's constantly putting her modernity, the 20th century, in relation to the French and American revolutions. But at the same time, she makes lots and lots of claims in the book about how, revolution can only be understood as a modern phenomenon, how the ancients never had any real concept of revolution. So she makes these sort of very historicist claims, while at the same time talking about what seems like, if not an unbroken tradition, some sort of I wouldn't necessarily call it tradition, but some sort of repertoire, if you like, of ideas which make sense of the phenomenon of collective action in some form.
Let's take that up, exactly, your use of the word repertoire. There is, of course, and you mentioned this earlier on, this repertoire, this tradition of German Philhellenism, which she both belongs to and it doesn't quite, and so you, I think, say she fundamentally reshapes it. What is your sense of her sitting in that tradition of German thinkers across quite a few decades, centuries even, engaging with the Greek classical tradition?
I mean, I think she's clearly deeply embedded in it. I think very specifically on revolution, I think she is dealing very directly with the legacy, for instance, of Marx and his understanding of antiquity. I mean, that's explicit. She talks about that in the book. I think it's very difficult to think about Hannah Arendt's engagement with the Greeks without bringing up Heidegger. I think Heidegger was very much in the background, foreground even, of her engagement with classical antiquity, but not in a slavish fashion. There are clearly continuities in terms of her engagement with the Greeks, her way and her way of talking about antiquity is not one as of sort of historical continuity, but of an attempt to sort of peel back modernity towards a kind of, what I talked about at the beginning, a kind of fresh encounter with classical antiquity. And that's something she shares very much with Heidegger, that methodology of not wanting, of trying to sort of get rid of the intervening periods between the Greeks and modernity. So there are clearly a very similar sort of methodological engagement with classical antiquity, and yet I think she's very clearly rejecting much of what Heidegger had to say about the Greeks. She's certainly twisting his sort of metaphysical engagement with the Greeks towards a political engagement. She's critiquing him through her engagement with the Greeks. But in addition to Nietzsche and Heidegger, who sorry, I don't think I've mentioned Nietzsche. Nietzsche, I think, is another incredibly important background in terms of her writings. And in some ways, I think her Greeks are probably more Nietzschean than Heideggerian. There are continuities there. But in terms of revolution, one could also link, as you've already mentioned, to Hegel. You know, that Hegel played an incredibly important role in making the Greeks part of a tradition of German identity and German political thinking, and he did that very much in the wake of the French Revolution. It was the French Revolution which acted as a filter very much for his political engagement with the Greeks. So I think it doesn't make sense to talk of Hannah Arendt outside of that story, and yet in a way I think she consciously steps outside of it. She consciously has a sort of ironic take on it, as well as clearly being in conversation with it in her writing.
In a wonderful way is also that I find how it comes out, and you point to that as well, is just how she also uses Marx's reading of the ancient texts to actually say Marx was misquoting, was misreading them, and it is on a different kind of reading that she then sets out her own thoughts. And obviously one area where this becomes particularly clear is around the one concept that she characterizes as the political concept par excellence, which is freedom, of course.
Yeah.
So for us today, it might sound really counterintuitive, but she argues that the centrality of freedom has been absolutely devalued or depreciated in modern political thought. And she puts a lot of the blame for that on Marx, precisely because she says it's his insistence on the rise of the social that has co-opted or contaminated the idea of the political. Now that is quite a controversial move. Can you help us sort of unpack that a little more?
Yeah, and I think it's centrally related to her analysis of revolution. So I think there were sort of two reasons why Arendt was interested in the phenomenon of revolution, and one of the very pressing issues was to sort of reclaim revolution from a kind of Marxist way of thinking. And the problem she had with Marx, and this becomes interestingly associated in the book between the differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. She sort of aligns Marx and the French Revolution, and then the other kind of legacy of revolution, which she associates herself with more, is the American Revolution. But that's the other problem with revolution, is the kind of revolution which disavows its own name. And the problem in the kind of American Revolution was that it was a revolution that then didn't have a kind of legacy, that sort of forgot that it was a revolution and lost that kind of initial excitement and initial kind of form of freedom. So she's critical of the sort of kind of American legacy of revolution, which sort of forgets that it is a revolution on the one hand, and then she's critical of the Marxist tradition of revolution, which, as you say, replaces what she sees as the kind of political ends of revolution with what she calls the social ends of revolution. And what she means by that is, by saying that revolutions are about freedom, what Arendt means is that revolutions are about kind of allowing citizens to perform properly, what she calls properly political acts, whereas the Marxist legacy of revolution made those, or kind of contaminated those political acts with economic ends. And so again, very counterintuitively, she has a big problem with the French Revolution being directed towards things like issues like poverty, right? Which we would think, well, why wouldn't you want to, see the kind of eradication of poverty as an end of revolution? But she sees that as being a misstep, because what you are doing in directing your resource, your sort of energies towards the eradication of poverty, is that you are mistaking the end, what she calls, and here she goes back to the ancients, the proper kind of outcome of political action should be the good life, and the good life is the life of kind of political association, the life of the kind of the public sphere, whereas the sphere of economics is really what she would associate with the idea of necessity, the area associated with our kind of biological needs, our what she calls the kind of life processes, rather than what she envisages as what's the kind of properly human ends, which is the public sphere of speaking and acting in common. So she thinks that, I mean, in more kind of contemporary terms, she thinks that we are all now far too materialistic. We see, when we talk about freedom, what we mean by freedom is kind of freedom of choice, freedom to choose to shop at Waitrose rather than Tesco or something along those lines, that we are far too oriented towards kind of economic freedoms, when what she was interested in was political freedom. And she thinks that Marx kind of confused the two. And the critique of Arendt is partly that she didn't understand the extent to which economics can be political. The ability to separate off those two spheres is much more complicated than she suggested, and that there was a reason why Marx was interested, saw political freedom as not being enough. For Marx, political freedom was the possibility of political freedom was curtailed by the perseverance of economic inequality in certain forms.
There's quite a lot of sort of corollaries to that criticism as well, which have partly been sort of taken back or re-evaluated, of course, but the questions of gender, the separation of the household, yes. So the relatively marginal mentioning that slavery gets when you look at the Greek polis. So all very interesting areas when it comes to sort of her wider situating of the ideal of politics. What is quite striking, I think, in this, and you mentioned the public sphere, the sort of outgoing, the appearing in public activities that for her politics is about, is just to what extent she really does cast this, and particularly on revolution, in a very clear theatrical language, a tragic vocabulary. So she talks about revolution in terms of a new story that appears, that has never been told before. She talks about its plot and the narrative. She even talks about people as both actors and spectators alike. So again, this is obviously a huge topic where you have the tragic and the political, but do you want to expand a little bit on how these two might relate in Arendt's thinking?
Yes, I mean, I think she talks about it fairly clearly in The Human Condition, where she talks about, and again, in a very sort of Heideggerian mode, she looks at the etymology of the word drama. And this is the kind of thing Heidegger does with his Greeks. He always looks at the kind of etymology of, he comes up with these sort of fourth etymologies of Greek terms to understand conceptual ideas. And this isn't actually a fourth etymology. The idea of drama is crucially related to the idea of action. So it's from the verb to do, right? Yes. And so when Hannah Arendt is talking, I think it's in the chapter on work, when she's talking about art, she says that drama is the political art par excellence, because drama is the sort of encoding of action. And I think that gives us a sense of why she's interested in tragedy, so she could have gone down the comic line. She doesn't actually preclude comedy when she discusses it in The Human Condition, but in her actual work she seems to take tragedy much more as again, which is has a long legacy in, for instance, in Hegelian thinking, to go back to tragedy as a kind of political metaphor. So I think that's because action becomes so central, and also Arendt is very clear that action on its own isn't good enough. What you need is action plus sort of some sort of remembrance or some sort of recollection of action. And drama is that making permanent of the kind of very fleeting moment of action. So you can see there why drama became a very important phenomenon for her. But then from there, she talks already in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she presents the Dreyfus affair as if it's a tragedy, right? And it's a metaphor that comes back in the Eichmann trial too. She uses dramatic metaphors there. But it's really in On Revolution where it's most explicit, where, as I said, I think I mentioned earlier, that she ends the text with this quotation from the Oedipus at Colonus. Should I talk a bit about that?
Yes, I was going to ask you very specifically, actually, about that relationship between the tragic and the definitive revolution in the way that it hinges on the same double bind, if you like, between freedom and necessity, and on our paradoxical relationship between what we can do and what we're forced to do, or what we're not allowed to do, be this by circumstance or power or fate. And that's something that the despotism of liberty, which Robespierre formulates, and specifically the Oedipus experience at Colonus, they both have that in common. And I just wondered whether you could explain for us what actually happens to Oedipus there. What does he say? What are the words that he's using, and why that becomes so incredibly relevant that he finishes that book on those lines. Yeah.
So we've talked, as you say, a little bit about how freedom and necessity are interesting ideas in her concept of revolution. She rejects the Marxist kind of analysis of revolution because of its attention to questions of necessity, to questions of sort of biological need, and moves towards freedom. So you can see that as a kind of background. But in the sort of German Hellenic tradition that we've been talking about, there was a very, very influential reading of tragedy which emerges around the time of the French Revolution, which has often been called things like the philosophy of the tragic, which moved away from a kind of the vision of tragedy that had largely dominated up to then, which was one of sort of aesthetic appreciation, one that sort of returned to tragedy via Aristotle, to thinking about how to form a perfect plot and so on and so forth, towards starting to think about tragedy as having something to do with the human condition in a very abstract sense, and how what tragedy repeatedly seemed to stage was an analysis of the human condition stuck somewhere between human agency on the one hand and determinism on the other, or fatalism. And this was a huge philosophical interest in the late 18th century, in particular to figures like Kant, but in relation to tragedy, to German idealism. And German idealism developed through figures like Schelling, Hölderlin and Hegel, developed an analysis of tragedy Oedipus becomes a kind of exemplary figure because his fate contrasts on the one hand, a kind of enormous power of human agency. So in his one of the kind of paradigmatic moments for Oedipus is his encounter with the Sphinx. And in his encounter with the Sphinx, who has been keeping the citizens of Thebes under her spell, and they've been suffering under her spell, Oedipus turns up and she asks him a question. And the answer to the question turns out to be man. And Oedipus uses his great intellect to overcome the Sphinx, who it represents the sort of forces of the irrational, but also of kind of fate, really, in some form of love. And there you see, in answering the question, man, Oedipus embodies what is greatest about man, which is human reason. So there you have Oedipus, one side of Oedipus, this figure who uses his intellect to tower over the forces of the irrational and shows human ingenuity at its best. The other side of Oedipus, as we all know, is the fact that his life is fated, and the fact that even though he manages to have this great success, he ends up by finding out that he has unsuspectedly murdered his father and married his mother, and all of this despite wanting to escape this fate. He finds out this fate from an oracle and does everything in his life to try and escape it. In the end, he ends up fulfilling it. And so this kind of paradox of how can you, on the one hand, exemplify the force of human reason, the ability to control one's own fate, on the one hand, on the other hand, being completely trapped by a fate that you can do everything you want to escape, but end up having to reenact, really became a sort of metaphor for this contrast between freedom and necessity. And for figures like Schelling and Hegel, Oedipus really exemplifies this contrast between what Arendt then talks about as sort of the possibilities of action versus a form of kind of determinism and unthinking sort of reproduction of fate in some form or another.
Because, of course, we say she finishes with the lines of Oedipus, but it isn't quite. She has a very few lines just after in which she actually talks not so much about Oedipus per se, but about Theseus, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, that's right. So Hannah Arendt goes to the final play of Oedipus, which is the play about his fate after he finds out that he has married his mother and killed his father, and he blinds himself. And the Oedipus at Colonus is all about what happens to live on after that realization. And there's this very famous moment in that play where the chorus narrate the Oedipus's fate, and they come up with what's called the wisdom of Silenus, which is the idea it's best never to be born. And the next best thing is to die quickly. So this incredibly sort of pessimistic outlook on life, which was a very, very important to Nietzsche's vision of the Greeks, that they had this clear-sightedness about the futility of existence, which you could see very much encapsulated in that ode. So the best not to be born. So Arendt goes to that and says, how is it that a poet can, on the one hand, tell us that, tell us that the kind of the encapsulation of what it is to be human is to have this futile existence where it's better never to be born, and on the other hand, in the same play, have this figure of Theseus, who's the ruler in Athens, who decides to bring in Oedipus as an outcast. It's the kind of moment of political asylum, basically. He decides to adopt Oedipus, knowing everything he knows about him, not unknowingly. He takes in this figure, this outcast, and sort of co-opts him into the city. And so that bringing Oedipus back into the community that Theseus embodies, for Arendt, is the antidote to the futility of existence, the possibility of living in common, the possibility of being part of a kind of political structure and political relationship for her redeems the futility of existence that we see enacted in the Silenus.
So that really is sort of the kernel of hope, if you like, the sort of utopianism, the redemption, put it that way, the redemption of the polis as an area where we can act together as human beings and sort of overcome this incredibly bleak realization of the limits of human action otherwise.
Yes, I think that's right. But it's also one, again, by putting it within the context of drama, I think what she's doing there is by showing us that even that is not, it's to an uncertain end. This is still a tragedy. Political actions can have great sources but lead to tragic outcomes. And I think what she wants to show in that end point is that actually it's that realization that action is fragile, that it's open-ended, but it's that open-endedness, that fragility, that possibility of it going wrong or right, which actually makes action really, really important. And I think that's why she ends on revolution in that way. It's not a kind of easy celebration of revolutionary movements. As I say, there's as much critique of things like the French Revolution in that book as there is praise. But what she comes back to, I think, is that we don't have anything other than kind of collective action to redeem ourselves. But a part of the kind of power of that collective action comes from that realization that we can't control it. That it has outcomes that we can't predict.
Which, of course, sort of is a parallel to what she wrote in The Human Condition, where she qualified action as both unpredictable and irreversible. Mm-hmm. And obviously the paradox is if something's irreversible, it restricts our freedom of action. So in some respects, where we are most free, we're also still constrained. But she overcomes that with references to forgiveness and to promise. Mm-hmm. So that movement to promise is perhaps not unaligned in some respects to Theseus adopting Oedipus. It is never a fully qualified redemption.
Yes.
But it is sort of a last movement of insisting that it's still necessary.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's also a very good way of sort of understanding the relationship between the origins of totalitarianism and on revolution, that on revolution is the promise, right? Mm-hmm. Because you might want to contrast it by saying, we haven't been able to talk about natality, and that is an important concept for her and is related to action. And one of the reasons why I think she's so interested in the Silenus Ode, because it's this explicitly anti-natalist text that's about best never to be born, right? Yes. And yet Arendt associates what it is to be human with being born, and the promise, if you like, of being born, the hope of being born. And so I think the relationship between On Revolution and some of her earlier work is partly to do with this idea of promise, and it's not something which then negates the dangers of action or the possible, because totalitarianism is also the outcome of action. Yes. In some form or other. So it's not a kind of utopianism, but there is a kind of potential there, which I think she wants to emphasise.
And with that, very, very nicely, we've kind of come back to the beginning in a suitably circular fashion, which Hannah Arendt tried to break through with her thinking. And the one thing we, as you say, didn't manage to talk about too much is the question of beginnings. But perhaps, we will have to end with an ending without the beginning, and maybe keep that for another time in the future. Thank you so much, Miriam, for a wonderful conversation. It's been absolutely wonderful to talk you through all those different areas of your work, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed.